called a boomba.
Yeah.
And what does boomba mean?
Oh, God,
Big bottom. If you eat these, you're going to get a big bottom. Okay, the punishment was in the actual name of the pastry. Natural justice. And this is saying you're going to experience natural justice. If you eat wrong, you're going to experience disease. If you fall off a cliff, you're going to die. In other words, there's a whole lot of justice that exists in the world. Nobody's sitting there dishing it out. It's the natural consequence, cause and effect. Natural justice. Now, in the early days, she was also tied up with hubris. And the greatest sin that you could perform was hubris, pride. And literally, it would often, Nemesis was her accomplice. We talk about your nemesis. Well, Nemesis was a goddess who accompanied or served justice, and Nemesis' role was to punish people with hubris. Interesting enough. It's funny when you hear these stories and see how it all fits together. Okay, the next one that comes along is time. This is old man time. This card, besides being called the Hermit, used to be called Il Tempo, time. And if you have a look at how he sits, he's walking west. In the medieval tradition, the beginning of the day was birth. And as the sun went across the sky and you went down, the sun went in the west, that was the end of life. So he's carrying a lantern, and we know that this is about the end of life. So what the Cathar was saying is, guess what, guys? Death is going to catch up with you. You think you can try and avoid getting old and the consequences of old and death? Nothing you can do about it. I'm sorry, but it's going to win. Doesn't matter how much money you got, doesn't matter how famous you are, doesn't matter how much love you have, it's all going to be taken away. All of it. And then the last card that you have to deal with is Fortune, the Wheel of Fortune. Good luck, bad luck. In other words, things can be going along hunky-dory, and then you have a bloody virus turn up. Or global financial crisis, or a war, or whatever it is. Good luck, bad luck. So in other words, we can't control these. Do you know how we try to control these, all three of them? Insurance. We take out insurance for all of those things. Life insurance, protection insurance, legal insurance. We spend our whole time forking millions of dollars to try and prevent what these guys are saying is inevitable. It's part of the human experience. Now here's what's interesting around, and if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask, because I'm just going to roll on.
When you said these guys are saying, just who do you mean?
The Cathars. In their deep theology. They're saying this is what this is all about, and they're telling us in these cards what it's about. Wheel of Fortune. Here's what's interesting. A wheel can turn one of two ways. It can go clockwise or anti-clockwise. If you go into the cathedral in Siena, there's the most beautiful Wheel of Fortune, but all of the characters are going clockwise. Anytime the wheel turns clockwise, there's a fourth character down the bottom. Anytime the wheel is depicted turning anti-clockwise, there's nobody at the bottom. So if we go clockwise, we've come around here, we've gone through here, and we're here and we go clockwise, guess where we go? The last character, each of these characters had a name, and I'm not going to give you their, I probably know it if I thought about it. The one going up is, I will rule. The one going down is, I have ruled. This one here is, I am the ruler. And the one down here is, I have no kingdom. So what happens is, if we keep on buying into the world of illusion, we get to midlife, we have what's called a midlife crisis. And what do? We're here, we're having a midlife crisis. I'll start all over again and I'll get a sports car and a younger woman and I'll do all of these things and I'll recreate the illusion again. And some people will do that several times. The other option, if we're at a crossroad, this is one of the crossroad options, is I'll stay right where I am. How do I do that? Antidepressants, drugs, addiction, anything that keeps me sort of keeping my head above water while I'm actually dealing with a whole lot of shit in my life. And we sit there. I also like to include new age shit and glitter in that. People get caught up in going to all these workshops and doing this stuff, and all the books sit there and they never do anything about it, and they've got all these books beside their bed that they've bought and they haven't read maybe even one of them, let alone a half of two of them. And they think they're doing the right thing, but it's no different to all the guys that are on antidepressants and all the rest of it. How much is that stuff affecting our world now? It's massive. It's massive. Okay, we have one of two other ways we can go. We can go down this route, which doesn't look very appealing. We'll talk about that. And up here, I'll throw the card up there that sits up there. And surprise, surprise, it is the death card. It's the judgment card, which is suicide. If we go that way, that's taking the shortcut to going into the grave. That's suicide. So here's the options that most of us only think that we have. Recreating the illusion, lost it all, I'll work my ass off and get it all back again. I'm a victim of all of this, can't control it, so I'll just opt out by distractions, whatever they are. Suicide. The Cathars said there is another choice, and it's the dark night of the soul. And it's so scary that you're going to need the sort of courage that it takes for a refined woman to hold open the mouth of a lion. That's the symbol that's being given here. It says this is a signpost. Just as this is a signpost, she's saying if you're going to come down this route here, you're going to need more courage than you can ever imagine, because you're going to have to let go of the illusion, the idea that any of this is real. You're going to have to shift your values so much that these things are not going to be important to you anymore in a world, while you're still alive, that values those things above anything else. And you're going to be expected in this journey to let go of those values. So let's really quickly go through. Now, here's an interesting thing. As we go down in this route here, we have the hangman. Excuse my bottom. And the hangman, look at the shape of his legs. The four again. And the hangman's saying, we're about to turn consciousness upside down. In other words, what you thought it was, this part of the journey now turns it upside down. And so I'll pop this one back over here, because it belongs there. And so the dark night of the soul is the hanged man. The death card. By the way, this isn't the death card, because the death card was old man time. He was about death. Have a look at what's different. Can anyone tell me what's different about that card to all the other ones?
Looking the other way.
Yes.
He's walking through.
Yep, there's something really obvious. Yeah, but there's no name on it. All the others are named. This card has no name. Okay? No, not a printing error. Temperance, the devil, and I'm just going to lay these out now, just so I don't have to come back. The House of God, the Star card, the Moon card, and the Sun card. Okay. So now you have a choice. The fourth option is to go into the dark night of the soul. Now she's saying two things, in fact. If you have a look, she's got the zigzag on top of a hat. It's a crown. And what she's saying is what you need is the hope of the crowning glory of Christ, or Christ consciousness. It isn't enough to have courage, you also need the hope that there's going to be the way to get back into the undifferentiated. Absolutely. You've got to have hope that that's going to be there. And so she's sort of basically saying, this is Hecate saying this is what you need. The first thing that's going to happen is, have a look at the framework that's holding the hanged man. What's significant about the framework?
They look like buds.
Yeah, trees that have actually been pruned. There's 3 arms to it. Guess who pruned them? Justice, time and chance have pruned back everything that the fool thought was important. His world's now been turned upside down, and in fact he's hanging in air. There weren't a lot of rituals around hanging people upside down. They used to do it to Jews because they felt that they were the most evil of all people, and if they were evil they needed to be removed from the earth, and in fact they wouldn't bury them so that they wouldn't pollute the earth. And sometimes they'd even hang dogs beside them who would attack them while they were hanging. Now, so we've gone through this process here of everything being taken away from us. It's all been snipped away. We've been brought to this place. Now, here's what I can tell you about the Cathars. The Cathars didn't subscribe to many of the Christian scriptures. Some of Revelations, the first 17 chapters of John and the Sermon on the Mount. And that was about it. They didn't subscribe hardly to anything else. One of the key scriptures in the Sermon on the Mount, and it's within the first 10 verses, is what's called the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, etc., etc. So here's a new innovation that I've been able to understand, and in fact the Beatitudes relate to these cards. This card here is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In other words, the point at which you've lost everything, it's been taken away, now you're teachable. Now you're in a place where you can actually inherit the kingdom of heaven. While you're still buying into this stuff, it's impossible. You need this to happen, and it's going to hurt, it's going to be humiliating, but it has to happen in order to make the transition. Can anyone remember what the second? Blessed are those that mourn, for they shall be comforted. If you have a look, you'll see that he has a scythe, and in the ground is, in this particular drawing, and it varies from, but basically what's in the ground is a king, a victor, the hand of the Pope being held in the Pope's position of blessing, and then a feminine hand. And it represents the severance, or the removal of attachment to the values of the material world. Now, what's really interesting about this card was, in this card, in these here, it's a skeleton with a bow and arrow. And he changed after the plague. Because up until then, death was seen to be like Eros, where you know, all of a sudden, an arrow of death would hit you and you were going to die. The plague came, and what they ended up with was a guy, was the skeleton on a horse with the scythe with 20 people in the scythe. Because now people were dying by the millions. And so it changed the whole nature of how they represented death in the cards. But they've gone a step further in this, because they're not in the scythe anymore. There's the severance, or the disattachment, or the non-attachment has taken place. And it's in the non-attachment that you can mourn versus grieve. There's a difference. Grieving is when you're still attached. Mourning is when there's no longer any attachment, and you can still, what's he doing? Well, in this one here, he's looking forward, by the way. It's interesting, in a lot of the other ones, he's actually looking back. and he's looking back at the world of illusion saying, this is what I've let go of. And he's mourning the loss, but he's not attached to it anymore. In fact, what they've done here is they've turned, because now mourning is the capacity to see a new reality, because you're no longer attached to the old. Grieving won't allow you to see a new reality because you're attached to the old. You know, in Italy, they have professional mourners. People who basically... And do you know where that came from? It was because the mourners in a community were the men. Men used to go into the square and they'd rip their hair out and go through all this. And the church said, no, men shouldn't be behaving that way. That's inappropriate. They outlawed men mourning. And so now it became the role of women. And in fact, what they ended up doing was having paid roles for women to go in and mourn to represent this process of grief having moved on. And so this is about looking at mourning in a whole new light, which says that I'm no longer attached to the illusion, and I'm now teachable. I'm now looking forward to the possibility of a new reality. Temperance turns up in a whole different way that we see temperance, and she's pouring water into a jug. So this is now representing new knowledge, new understanding of love. This relates to... Does anyone know the third one? Neither do I at the moment, because I've just forgotten. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So this is about being teachable. At this point, you're now ready to take on new knowledge, new understanding. And in fact, have a look at the flower on the top of her forehead. It's a rose, 5-petal rose. What colour is it? Classically, what would be the 5-petal rose would normally be? Well, it's the symbol of purity. And a white one is the symbol of being a virgin. So oftentimes a 5-petal white rose would represent the mother of Jesus. She was the ongoing virgin. And so you see the rose windows often represent this whole notion. But now the rose is red. What does that mean? She's not a virgin anymore. And guess what's happened? The Christ has now been conceived. This is in fact the conception card. The water being poured into the jug is the conception of Christ's consciousness into the consciousness of humanity at this point. And so now we see the water being poured into the jug, and this is now the beginning of Christ starts to emerge in the full. That's the conception, the point of conception.
And she's looking west.
Well,
Looking about this way.
yeah, yes.
Looking
Forward. In fact, in a lot of them she's looking at the water pouring in. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. In fact, what it's saying is if you're meek, you're humble. Earth, the word humus, is the foundation to the word humility. And that's where the word humus shares the same root as the word earth. And so you inherit the earth by virtue of the fact that you're teachable, and you're now being impregnated with Christ consciousness at this point. And the next thing that happens is the devil card. Interesting place. The beatitude that relates to this one is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. So what happens is, this isn't about being a little peckish, by the way. And the reason that we have a devil card there is to describe the level of issue that you will deal with in trying to adopt that level of commitment or devotion to Christ consciousness. In this case, righteousness. So in Matthew 25, we have a beautiful description of the righteous. And they were the people who fed the hungry, gave water to the thirsty, clothed the naked. That was, and he refers to them as the righteous. And he even goes so far as to say the ones in my right hand get to move ahead, and the ones in the left hand, which are the ones who aren't righteous, who don't do any of those things, get to go to hellfire and damnation. So they're even depicting that in the card. But here we have the flaming sword. This is the point at which, if you want to move any further forward, if you want to enter the house of God, which is seen in that card there, you now have to be able to perform the sacrifice of the child. It's the Abrahamic sacrifice. It's Abraham sacrificing Isaac. Why did God want Abraham to sacrifice Isaac?
To show his obedience?
Sorry?
Just to show his obedience?
Absolutely, that he was prepared to be more devoted to God than he was to Isaac. What's the significance of his devotion to Isaac?
Differentiate.
If you read the story of Abraham, his whole life was about trying to heal his own deep wound with his father. This would be a psychologist's dream, because his father gets annoyed at stuff that Abraham's doing, gets into hoots with the king, and the king puts out a judgment to have Abraham murdered. And so Abraham has to leave his father. So who does he take with him? Lot. He takes his nephew with him because he needs... This is about the connection of the father and the son. And of course, it isn't enough. What's the main issue that Abraham has with God? God keeps promising him a son. How old are they when Sarah and Abraham finally get to have a son? In their hundreds. But he couldn't wait all that time, and so Sarah says, well, look, why don't you take my concubine and have a son to her? So he gives birth to Ishmael. See, all the way through, Isaac's got this whole issue about needing to be with the son, with the child. And so this is his narrative. My value is defined by my relationship with my children, based on my own deep wound of the fact that I was cut off from my own father. And so what's being told here, and this is what we all have to do, is we each have to sacrifice the narrative of our 7-year-old, which is about our loveless, unlovable sense that we have about who we are in the world. Because that's what keeps us distracted from God, is being caught up into trying to get the love that the 7-year-old wants, which isn't found in God. It's found in our relationship with our family and all the things of the world of illusion. And so this is the test of the flaming sword.
Is that like self-love?
It is. Ultimately, it's coming to that place, but it's about knowing what you have as your narrative that says, I'm not lovable, and being able to identify that. And that becomes part of what that journey's about. Once you've passed that test, then you get to go into the house of God. Now this looks like a funny house of God, but here's a building with people falling out of it, and depending on at which era either the flames are coming out of the temple or they're going into it, it varied from place to place. This is the scripture where Jesus said, if you're going to follow me, you've got to give up mother, father, brother, sister, children, husband, wife, and your home and your lands. In other words, total non-attachment to the illusion, even special relationships. And that's what makes it possible to moving beyond special relationship. It doesn't mean that you don't have those things. It means that you're not attached to them. And once you're able to do that, then you come into, these are all about light now, and this is the treasury of light. This is about now moving into the kingdom of heaven. So here we have the star card. Blessed are the merciful. So she's now pouring works of mercy. So the one that's being poured onto the land is based on the one that we had here in the devil card, which is hungering and thirst after righteousness, helping the needy, doing those physical things in terms of social justice. But now we've entered into forgiveness. And this is about now living a life totally devoted to living with forgiveness, where everything that you're doing is about forgiving yourself, forgiving others. That becomes the foundation to how you do it. So she's pouring water in that. The 7 lights up the top there, they represent the candelabra, the menorah in the temple, because now you've entered the temple, the house of God, and this is the menorah. So these are the gifts of the Spirit: knowledge, wisdom, understanding, awe of God, piety, courage, listening to the Spirit. They're all gifts of the Spirit. So now your whole world is fully enveloped into the gifts of the Spirit. That's what you're hearing. You're being guided with knowledge and understanding. You're not ignorant anymore. This is the world of ignorance. Now you're being really directed and giving clear instruction. And now we come to the moon card, and this is the birth of Christ. The Christ is now being born in the pool. And how do we know that? Because of the crustacean in the pool. Crustaceans, crabs, lobsters, didn't matter what they were, they all were related to Cancer in the astrology. And right in the centre of Cancer is a constellation that's called the crib or manger. And in fact, once again, this is a new bit of information that I've been able to add to the tarot world, is the meaning of this card. I believe I'm the first person to reveal that bit of information. This is the birth of the Christ. So in other words, conception took place here. You've been developing Christ consciousness through social justice, spiritual justice, mercy, forgiveness. So you've done everything within your power. You've let go of your attachment to the world of illusion. So that's everything that you can do in your own power to prepare for the birth of Christ. The point at which you become the birth of Christ, you now have a test. And the test of the dogs. This was the odour of sanctity. Did you smell right? And if you didn't smell right, the dogs would attack you. And so in order to pass the gatekeepers, you have to smell right. What does it look like to smell right? That's what we call the fruits of the Spirit. So your life would be fully immersed in joy, love, peace, kindness, gentleness, goodness, mercy, temperance, all the things that were referred to in Galatians. That would be how you live your life. They would smell. If there was pride, envy, greed, gluttony, sloth, all the things that we'd call, if any of those things exist, you wouldn't be able to pass the gatekeeper. Once you've passed the gatekeeper, then you do your role as the Christ, and that is, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. And this is the point at which, as the Christ, you now walk the world being enlightenment and modelling that to the world around you, and you become a light to the world. At that point, once the Christ consciousness has evolved to that point, then we see the Hieros Gamos. This is the sacred union between Sophia, who is us as the human. This is Gnostic philosophy. So Sophia is the daughter of Sophia the mother, and that's us as the fool. Now is marrying the Hieros Gamos. This is the alchemical union of the human and the Christ. And if you have a look, this character here coming out of the grave, in nearly every drawing of that resurrected figure, it's an androgyny. One half of the body is masculine and the other half is feminine. It's got female hips and bottom, and the other one's very masculine. And it's been drawn that way because now, with the sacred union that's taken place here, he now rises as the androgyny, which is the Sophia and Christ now being one. And he passes the test or not. So you'll see two characters there are still very masculine and feminine. Guess what? They didn't pass the test of the cherubim. Guess where they get to go? Back here. And they get to do it again. It's called reincarnation. In the androgyny, you don't get to do that. You now come back to the sacred yoni. And this is the Christ now entering the sacred yoni of the mother. And it's only the Christ that can enter the sacred yoni of the mother to return back into undifferentiated consciousness. Now, I've sort of sped things up there at the end because we're getting a little bit long-winded. But this is what they were teaching in these cards, they were giving a very deep, profound explanation for the spiritual journey. And this was much more profound than the Catholic Church and what it was teaching at the time. And you can see why it threatened the Church by virtue of what it was that they were teaching. Yes?
Can I ask, could you just talk a little bit about the devil?
The devil.
Representation. Why the devil then?
Because this is the point at which we're most tempted to want to go back into the world of illusion. At this point, because we're basically being asked to sacrifice the child. By the way, that whole child sacrifice thing, most cultures had that as an intrinsic part of their beliefs. The idea of the father sacrificing the child. The Greeks, I can't remember the name of it, you'll read it in my book because I can't pronounce the name, but the king sacrifices his daughter. When I was going through the Civitavecchia, which is the ancient city outside of Rome, just north, it was the harbour, the shipping harbour for Rome originally, and just north of that, I would come across, and I've got photos in my book of these underground cities, necropoli, dead cities, where the Etruscans built streets and homes replicating their real life, but it was all for the dead. And in some of these homes, there would be a passageway carved in the shape of the yoni that would go for about 8 to 10 foot, and you could just get your shoulders through to walk through this to go into a rear chamber. This was about the passage. Now what's interesting is the sarcophagi, and this is what was generally in there, were urns where they would put the ashes of the dead people. The urns typically were covered in sacrificial parent sacrificing child as an intrinsic part of those urns, drawings on their sarcophagi. Once again, I make reference and my research where I get it from to back that up in my book. So really the devil is about this real profound turning point of whether you're ready to enter the house of God or not, which is the next card. And it's the test. You can't go into the house of God if you still have a 7-year-old pulling the strings. I have a really lovely diagram of this adult woman sitting as a puppet, and she's got these strings, and a young girl holding the strings, and that's a bit like you and I. You know, we've got this 7-year-old inside of us that's pulling all of our strings about, you know, any time you're out of your piece, I can tell you this right now, any time you're out of your piece, your 7-year-old's in control.
Yeah. And so, can I just ask about with the birth of Christ one?
Yes.
Is that represented? This is when we are born.
That's when the Christ is born in us.
Yeah, like we've reached that stage where.
So it becomes Russell the Christ. In fact, and that's the point at which your life then becomes fully devoted to walking the planet as an exemplar of that, as a way of life. That's more important to you than any of this stuff here.
Yeah. So when you get to that stage of enlightenment, you know, you can draw the analogies of what they, you know, the guru, all enlightened. You can then, you'll go to heaven. You don't have to bother reincarnate.
Well, at that point, you're already undifferentiated. Once you get to that point of the Christ being born in you, you're at a place of undifferentiation, which means that the natural place for you to go when you leave this incarnation is to be reintegrated with that which is undifferentiated. That's what the Christ does. Yeah, so we have a program called the Enhancers Awareness Program, which basically walks people through this part of the journey, through the dark night of the soul. We actually bring people to the test of the flaming sword as part of that journey. And then I've just, in the last couple of weeks, instituted another program which uses my book, which is about taking people through this other part of the journey, in terms of becoming a sounding board for having you reflect on your, you know, enlightenment in terms of those enlightened values. But you've got to have done this work first before you even consider to do this work.
Which is a one-on-one.
Yeah.
But you've got to go through that.
Yeah.
So where does the process of, you know, Indian African, so where does the process of meditation help in that part? Because it's not in
Right. So, so I use meditation and I actually have my own devoted space in my home, and I use these images, and in fact I use all of these images here in my meditation. And so I have a 1 hour practice where I contemplate the significance of those things and what it means to me. Now, the meditation in and of itself is nothing other than it's the reminder about how I choose to walk through my day, about whether I'm choosing acts of mercy socially or spiritually as the basis of how. So my meditation is literally my anchor to remind me to walk with Christ consciousness through my day. And I spend an hour most days setting myself up for that just to, because I need it. I'm slow. I have to admit, I'm probably the worst learner. People can do it much more quickly than what I do. I need an hour just to give me that level of...
I need 3 hours. Because I don't go there. I call it practicing meditation, because I belong to a path.
Okay.
Light and sound. And you trained and you're given the mantra.
Yep.
And,
So I have a visual mantra. And each morning I go through each of these cards sequentially, and I have a process. I have scriptures that relate to them, and it's contemplative. But let me tell you, I can be sitting there, and next thing I'm off with the fairies. So there's still a mindfulness practice that's still got a meditation practice that still has to be incorporated in that to have my mind stay really. These days I don't get drawn off very often, but it's still a significant part. When I get to this part here in the meditation, I have a menorah and I light 7 candles, and it reminds me when I get to this part here, I light frankincense, which was it was used in the temple as part of that ritual. And when I get up to here to the sacred yoni, I light rose essence, as a part. So I'm using smell, I'm using sight, I also have music that I incorporate. So I'm using a whole lot of different ways of helping to infuse. So for example, this is my Camino ring, and it's got the cross of St. James and it's got the scallop shell. That's the sacred union of Jesus, not Jesus, of the Christ and Sophia. And then around my neck, I've got the 2 lemniscates, the sacred yoni and the cross, which is the Christ here entering the sacred yoni here. So I wear these all day. And if I find myself going out of piece, these are my mantra. I have physical mantras, so I'm not just relying on my mind. Sometimes if I'm struggling, I'll go and get the rose or the frankincense and light it just to help reignite that connection with that again. And I'll do that in the middle of the day because I'm feeling I've gone off and I need something to help centre me back again. So I'm a little bit different in terms of how I approach it because I've married all of the senses into being able to help reconnect with that as my commitment to staying on that path. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I'm aware that there's different levels of meditation and it's just an evolving thing. And eventually, if you get tired of one meditation, you just have to keep going. You've got to keep changing. You've got to keep rising.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. We spent a lot of time in India, and there's a lot of parallels between this teaching and Hinduism and the Vedanta and their teachings as well. It's so similar in so many ways, and all rivers lead to the same ocean. A lot of religions, this is the foundation of what they were talking about, and it all leads to the same.
I have very little knowledge. I have some, but very little, and so it's nice to hear that sort of feedback. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the next book.
Yeah. No, that's his book. No, it's not mine. I know what my limits are, and that's going too far. Thank you, everyone, for being here today.